Good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here. I'm Patricia Turner, Director of the Division of Member Services for the ACS, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 History of Surgery Community Breakfast Meeting. We know that it's a new day with COVID, so we've had to make some changes, but really it's a pleasure to know that you all are here and engaged and interested in our upcoming discussions. I'd also like to thank Megan Kennedy, who's done an amazing job as our archivist, and Dr. Pappas, who's done a terrific job chairing this committee, and look forward to the exciting program that we have planned for you. Dr. Pappas.
Thanks, Dr. Turner, and thanks everyone for signing on. Just a couple of things that we're going to go over about how we're going to try to organize this. You'll notice that when we have an individual speaker speaking, we'll probably shut the rest of our cameras off just so as not to distract from the speaker. And if you've ever done some of these webinars before, when it's just a speaker, sometimes it's easier just to see that face. So you'll notice that we'll blink off here in a little bit once the speakers start. Well, also, Megan's got control of the audio for almost everybody, I guess, including me. So she's going to shut most of us off most of the time. And then we'll turn people on strategically so we can hear them. So again, it's more of a webinar format as opposed to everybody speaking up all at once. As we go along, we got a couple talks, and there'll likely be questions after those talks, and we'll go over before and after those talks about how you can ask questions in this format so we can contribute to the conversation by asking questions. So I think without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll see if I can advance the slides. So this is just briefly the agenda, if you can see that. We're gonna, Megan's gonna give a brief update. I'll review briefly the committee structure for this community. Patrick will talk about the poster session awards, and then we'll end with our two speakers, the winner of our fellowship, Cynthia Tang from last year, and then Dr. Craig Miller will talk at the end. And so that's what we're going to try to do briefly today. And again, this is, if you look on your controls, there's a way to ask questions, and you can simply type in the question and hit send, and then Megan will see it, and then she's going to tee those up for us to answer for you. There's also a raise hand sign, which we can use. It'd be a little bit easier for us to organize them if everybody asks questions in the question box. That's our preference. But if you choose to raise your hand, we'll be answering that also. Megan.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just wait while I get controls of the slides. I'm Megan Kennedy. I'm the archivist here at the college, and I'm just going to give a real brief update about what the archives has been up to over the past year. So our mission in the archives is to advance the goals of the college by acquiring, preserving, and providing access to records of enduring value. Our 2019-2020 activities have been pretty on par with prior years. Obviously, this year's been a little bit different in terms of in-person visits. The archives has been effectively closed down to outside researchers since March. Michael Beasley, our assistant archivist, has been in the office once or twice a week since, I believe, June or July, which has been great for him to be able to do some work on our in-person research requests that use material that are only available on site as opposed to our digitized collections. In terms of updates along our programming, the archives website continues to update our material regarding to the History and Archives Committee. That includes updating meetings like this one, which will be available on demand after the meeting is over. We also provide updates to the 25 and 50-year fellowship celebration web pages. Those are for our anniversary fellows, and we upload things like the Clinical Congress News, convocation booklets, and photographs from their convocation year, which is a really popular thing that's been very successful the last few years, and it's nice for them to be able to reminisce about their fellowship year. We also host the surgical education modules on the archives website, and you can view all those by going to facs.org/archives. In terms of the collections care, we continue to process our backlog. Obviously, that's slowed down a little bit with our limited time in the office, but we have been providing a lot of remote reference with our digital collections. And again, I mentioned with Michael being in the office, we've been able to fulfill most of our requests fairly quickly. Another thing we've been doing, of course, is converting to the virtual meeting. Dr. Greifenstein will mention our transition to a virtual poster session, which I think was really successful. There's been a lot of behind the scenes work getting that completed. And the last thing I wanted to mention was a migration to a new collection management software that the archives is going through right now. I've included a screenshot here. For those of you who've looked at the archives catalog, you'll probably notice it's similar, but we've added a lot of really great features with this upgrade. On the left-hand side, you'll see a lot of facet searches available. So we're gonna give everybody the ability to narrow down their searches by different criteria like date or still image. They can narrow it down just by images or even collections that are available digitally. We can also narrow down by a specific person or topic. So there's a lot of increased usability with this upgrade. And as soon as it's live, I'm hoping by the end of October, I'll be sending out a link to the History of Surgery community. And I would love for everybody to try it out, test it out. If you have any comments or questions or problems, please reach out and let us know. We are doing the migration to make everything easier. So we're hoping that this does it and would love your feedback. So I'll hand it back to Dr. Pappas. Thanks.
Great. And I forgot to remind everybody, we're calling this a breakfast, even though there's no food and it's in the evening. That was done because we're presuming next year at this time we'll be meeting live and there'll be breakfast and it'll be at early in the morning. So it's the same content that we usually do for our breakfast, thus we kept the name just so we wouldn't confuse ourselves. Just as a reminder, the History and Archives Committee, the mission, which is stated there, to advance, promote, sustain, and expand the recognition, appreciation, presentation, preservation, and the study of American surgical history. You can see the other items. And just as a reminder, so that's why we function. We did make a change in the bylaws last year. Calling ourselves just the surgical history group was a little bit confusing to some because it didn't fit with the normal words and names and titles that the college has used. And so we did morph the surgical history group into the History and Archives Committee. That change was approved by the Board of Regents last year. And the History and Archive Committee is the governing body of the History of Surgery community. And of course, to be in the community, all you have to do is be on the blog and read what we're talking about every week. It's not complicated. We did change the bylaws of the organization to match that. The only other major change is we're trying to work on getting some more young surgeons into the organization and have put together a subcommittee to help stimulate that growth. These are the History and Archive Committee chairs for this year and the upcoming year, and you'll see Carol Scott Connors, the vice chair of this group, and then you see Dr. Trotter, the Organization Bylaws Committee, Dr. Kernahan for the Archives Committee, Patrick for the Program Committee, Dr. Nesbitt for Outreach Committee, and then Justin Barr for the Young Surgeons Committee. This is a broader look at our entire org chart for those who are interested, and we're happy to post this. Megan, you'll have to remind me whether this is available to them, and if not, we can certainly post it on the blog on one of the weekends so folks can get a better sense of it, but this is how we're currently structured. And just a couple other things that you may have noticed. We do get to publish some of our works in the American College of Surgeons Bulletin. And so in the Bulletin in the last 12 months, these are just some of the articles that appeared that came directly out of our group. The last two were from the poster session last year. The first and second place winners ended up generating a brief manuscript that was in the bulletin last year. So this, we try to continue to encourage our members to publish, and the bulletin has been nice enough to put together, allow us to put together small articles for a presentation of the bulletin. These are the events we're going to participate in for the virtual clinical congress this year, airing on October 6th, the Tuesday at about noontime at Central Time, is our panel, which is entitled Surgical Specialties and Their Evolution. That's the panel that we're sponsoring this year. The poster session, again, you're going to hear a little bit more about what we've already basically had that, and it'll be posted in a virtual poster hall beginning on Saturday, 8 a.m. on October 3rd. And then the Churchill, the Churchill lecture will be aired Tuesday, 9 a.m. on October 6th. American Surgery, the Imperative to Lead and Evolve at the Speed of Relevance. And then the Icons of Surgery video series was postponed this year. Just some general numbers about what's happening with our community. And our community, again, or anybody who logs on to the community during the year is considered a member, and we've slowly increasing there, with a lot of people discussing and interacting on that blog, and then an increasing number of library documents. So this is a representation of how active our community is. And a reminder, our fellowship that we've been doing is a $2,000 grant per year, given for scholarly study of the history of the American College of Surgeons, the history of American surgery. And the purpose is to allow some funding so an individual can use the archives of the college to create his evaluation of history. This year's award was actually postponed due to travel restrictions, so we decided not to make the award this year because we were concerned that the winners usually will travel to Chicago and access the archive, and since it's not possible this year, we've decided to postpone it for this year. All right, poster session.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pappas. It is an honor to present this year's poster session. We had an incredible field. It was 187 initial abstracts were presented. 20 of these were judged to be chosen for presentation, and then we had a finalist of 5. The titles you see there are the 5 abstracts that were selected for the final judging. And these 5, it was actually a very well structured virtual presentation. The 20 initial posters were presented. These were recorded, and the judges looked at these individually. And then we all scored. There were 10 judges, and we scored these as the top 5 posters for potential contenders for the prize. And these are the 5 that you see there. They were all excellent. The presenters were phenomenal, spanned the gamut of medical students, senior physicians, and even a non-physician historian / writer who ended up taking the top prize. You want to scroll to the next one. So our first prize winner was titled Susan Dimmick, MD, Pioneer Female Surgeon. This was a fascinating look into an otherwise little known figure in American surgical history, a woman of an incredible pioneering skill and insight and ability. And a tragic end. I urge you to look into this a little further. There should be a book in print, I believe, in the near future. And our second place was a close second, a very, very tight race, was the rise and fall of gender identity clinics in the 1960s and 1970s, presented by a medical student, Melanie Fritz, from Boston University. These, among the other 20 top posters, will be made available to members of the college to view at their leisure, I believe in the next coming week or so. The links should be available through our History and Archives Committee web link. Next. And now I hand it over to Dr. Tang.
I'd like to go ahead and introduce Cynthia Tang. Cynthia is a PhD candidate in the history of medicine from McGill, and she's the recipient of our 2019-2020 fellowship. She's going to talk about seeking control of the laparoscopic revolution, 1989 to 1995. I've had the pleasure of speaking on the same meeting platform with Dr. Tang before on this subject, and she tells a very interesting story, and we will be happy to hear her talk. And then at the end, again, we'll be taking questions. So if you have questions along the way, go ahead and type them in, and then we'll retrieve them at the end to ask Cynthia the questions. So take it away. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for that introduction and also the promotion. I haven't defended yet, but I hope to defend by the end of the year. So yeah, thanks very much for having me here today. It's really an honor to get to speak about my work on the history of laparoscopic cholecystectomy as part of the American College of Surgeons Clinical Congress, especially since a lot of the excitement for lap chole was first generated at this very meeting 31 years ago at the 75th Clinical Congress held in 1989 in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'd like to thank the History and Archives Committee as well for awarding me this fellowship and giving me this opportunity, especially Megan Kennedy and Michael Beasley for being so accommodating and helpful on my visits to the college archives for my dissertation research. So again, my dissertation looks at the emergence of lap chole, which is often referred to as the beginning of the laparoscopic revolution in abdominal surgery. And this description alludes both to the transformative effect that the procedure had on surgical practice, as well as to the rapid pace at which it supplanted open cholecystectomy as the gold standard treatment for gallstones. Let's see if this works. I can't, oh, there. Okay. Right, so although interest in lap chole only took off starting in April 1989, by the end of 1991, it was used in over 75% of total cholecystectomies in the United States. The uncontrolled adoption of lap chole led to high complication rates ranging from relatively moderate injuries to severe organ damage and death. Oh. Within 2 years of lap chole's emergence, mass media newspapers started reporting the high complication rates resulting from the new procedure. In New York State, health officials even felt that it was necessary to step in and institute regulations on who was allowed to perform the surgery, which was something that had never happened before for a surgical procedure. So in my talk today, I'm going to discuss some of the issues that were faced in the early days of lap chole with respect to training. And I'll start by telling the most common narrative that is given about the development and emergence of lap chole before talking about the early days of lap chole training. And I know many of you were active during this period and are familiar with some of the narratives. And if anyone is interested in sharing your experience with me, please feel free to contact me. You can find my contact information on my website at cynthiaaltang.com. In any case, I hope that everyone will come away from my talk having learned something new about the history of lap chole. So In 1987, a patient visited the private clinic of the Lyonnais surgeon Philippe Moret to receive treatment for a gynecological disorder. During their consultation, the patient requested that her gallbladder also be removed during the same session. After first treating her pelvic adhesions laparoscopically, Moret strategically aimed the laparoscope upwards and removed her gallbladder, completing the first cholecystectomy by laparoscopic approach. When he checked on his patient the next morning, she was up, ready to leave, and upset at him because without the expected scar, she believed that he had not removed her gallbladder as he had promised. A few months later in Paris, another surgeon, François Dubois, performed a cholecystectomy and showed the new nurse on his surgical team what he believed to be the smallest scar in the world after gallbladder removal. As he recalled to me in a 2017 interview, "One day I'm doing a cholecystectomy on a pretty girl, and in the operating room I said, 'Well, she's going to be happy, I have not disfigured her.' But the nurse was not impressed. Coincidentally, she had just moved to Paris from Lyon, where she had worked with Moret. The nurse said, 'Yes, but Dr. Moret does it better.' Dubois was furious, and she said, 'Yes, he does them laparoscopically.' Dubois was especially furious because he had been actively trying to minimize the size of incision necessary to remove a gallbladder since the 1970s, and pioneering what he called a mini laparotomy cholecystectomy. When I asked what his motivation was to make incisions smaller, he replied, 'It was aesthetic. One of my motivations was a Marilyn Monroe photograph. At the end of her life, a photographer took nude photos of her, and you could see that she was a very beautiful girl, but she had an enormous scar. It was a tragedy.' And so, driven by his desire to minimize the effects on female beauty produced by his scalpel, Dubois overcame his initial indignation and contacted Moret to inquire about the laparoscopic technique. The two surgeons met at the Hilton Hotel in Paris, where Moret showed Dubois videos he had taken of two lap choles. Impressed, Dubois began working on developing the technique further. Dubois published his first academic paper reporting the technique in the May 1989 issue of La Presse Médicale, followed by an English report in the Annals of Surgery in January 1990. By the time Dubois' English report was printed, lap chole was already being used in the United States, where Barry McKernan and Bill Say in Marietta, Georgia, were the first to perform a lap chole in June 1988, closely followed 3 months later by Eddie Reddick and Douglas Olson in Nashville, Tennessee. The Americans also published their technique, but in lesser known publications such as Laser Medicine and Surgery News and Surgical Endoscopy, which in 1988 was only 2 years old. However, the trigger for the explosion of interest in lap chole was not its first reporting in journals, but the videos of the technique that were shown in the trade exhibition halls at the Society of American Gastrointestinal Endoscopic Surgeons meeting held in Louisville, Kentucky in April 1989. And as I said, at this very meeting held 31 years ago by the American College of Surgeons in Atlanta, Georgia. The video of lap chole that was shown at the April SAGES meeting was presented by Jacques Parassa, a professor of surgery at the University of Bordeaux, as well as a friend and colleague of both Moret and Dubois. When he showed his video of lap chole at the April SAGES meeting, surgeons crowded around his booth saying, "Unbelievable, we must do that tomorrow." And to him, the excitement that was generated was, quote, like this nuclear explosion. Similarly, Douglas Olson believes that the pivotal milestone in the development of lap chole was the 1989 Clinical Congress, where he and Reddick presented their videos of lap chole on behalf of the laparoscopic and laser instrument companies. For example, Laserscope, US Surgical, and Storz. According to Olson, when he and Reddick announced their formal lap chole courses at the Clinical Congress, they had, quote, surgeons falling over themselves to get a slot in the course. But unlike Reddick and Olson, Parassa declined the initial requests for training. Along with a feeling of elation from the enthusiasm that his video generated, Parassa also felt a sense of caution. For him, it was not simply a new technique that could be taught through the more traditional see one, do one, teach one model. As Parassa explained to me in 2017, We could not put this in the hands of those surgeons, even if they had very good mastery of open surgery. They needed to have a new education in laparoscopy, beginning with how to insufflate properly the abdominal cavity. And so the demand after Louisville, please, where can I learn lap chole? It was the wrong question. We could not jump straight to lap chole. It requires a long-lasting period of training. Similarly, in the months following the Louisville meeting, the SAGE's leadership determined that they needed to get involved in training surgeons to perform lap chole. They quickly realized that not only did proper training courses have to be organized, they had to have surgeons who could teach the courses. To this end, they began organizing a program to, quote, train the trainers. But even before such a program could begin, they again needed surgeons with enough experience to teach the trainers of the trainers. According to Jeffrey Ponsky, who was president of SAGES at the time, the plan to control the spread of lap chole through coordinated training was for interested surgeons who were on the board of governors to go for training with the pioneers. These surgeons, who can be described as first-generation adopters, would then lead courses for academic surgeons and those who were the directors of surgical training programs, the second-generation adopters. The trained trainers could then return to their institutions to offer courses to community surgeons who would belong to the third generation of adopters. Though it was hoped that the first and second generation adopters would remain a relatively small group of academic surgeons, as we will see, not all surgeons followed this plan to have a structured spread of the technique. Meanwhile, the Nashville team continued to host surgeons in the operating room. As Olson recalled, before the 1989 Clinical Congress, surgeons were visiting him and Reddick in Nashville to do a mini proctorship where surgeons would come spend time with us in the OR observing. We would lecture them as we would operate and then have discussions in between cases. According to Olson, we did our first formal course in November 1989, but they really took off in 1990. Newspaper articles reported that surgeons paid $3,000 for 2 days in Nashville, attending lectures and practicing lap chole on pigs. For $1,000, surgeons could spend the day observing Reddick's procedures. By February 1990, Reddick claimed to have already trained over 500 surgeons from around the world. With more surgeons getting trained in the procedure, journalists began to report on the new, less invasive gallbladder surgery that speeds recovery, reduces costs, and eliminates hospital stays. And such articles were essentially announcements to the community that their local surgeons and hospitals were offering lap chole, and they quickly generated interest in the procedure amongst patients suffering from gallstones. A surgeon in Mississippi, for example, performed the first lap chole in the state on December 15, 1989 at the Methodist Hospital of Hattiesburg. This was reported 2 days later in the Hattiesburg American, followed by reports in the local newspapers of nearby Greenwood and Clarksdale. Just 3 weeks after his first lap chole was reported, he told the same reporter, "I have patients coming to Hattiesburg from all over the state. What this is doing for Hattiesburg has really caught me off guard. People are staying in motel rooms until their surgeries. It's really generating business." But beyond the prestige that came with being the first, there was also a major economic incentive to being the only surgeon or hospital in an area offering lap chole. As it was later explained in the Wall Street Journal, the first one in the community who does it gets all the gallbladders for a while. On the other side of this equation, however, was the potential to lose patients the longer a surgeon did not provide this procedure. Surgeons were quickly pressured to learn and offer the procedure as news of lap chole spread amongst the public. Once they heard about the benefits, some patients chose to postpone treatment until the new procedure was available in their area. As one patient in San Antonio, Texas, told a reporter in January 1990, though she was suffering stabs of pain in her right side in November, she refused to undergo the conventional technique and insisted on waiting until preparations were finished for the new form of the procedure to be offered. The high demand for training in lap chole quickly opened the door for a seller's market in laparoscopic surgery training courses. In the absence of enough spots in academic courses, some first-generation adopters quickly began to offer training to the growing number of interested surgeons, independent of the structured spread that the SAGE's leadership were hoping would take place. Just weeks after performing his first lap chole in December 1989, the Hattiesburg surgeon was already hoping to offer classes to teach other surgeons the techniques by March. By August, it was reported that he had provided training for 100 surgeons throughout the United States. Similarly, surgeons who were the first to perform the procedure in the state of Wisconsin in December 1989 announced that they would be running a 2-day training program at the beginning of April 1990. But surgeons, hospitals, and patients were not the only stakeholders to be enthusiastic about the emergence of lap chole. Laser and laparoscopic instrument manufacturers were also highly invested in the technique's adoption and played a key role in enabling the scramble for training. While it was a generally accepted practice for manufacturers to furnish courses with the instruments needed for practical components, some companies made more substantial investments. US Surgical, for example, helped William Fay and Eddie Reddick to establish the Advanced Laparoscopic Training Center in Marietta, Georgia. As the Wall Street Journal reported in December 1990, Say and Reddick have trained more than 1,300 doctors since June at a laboratory with 9 operating rooms crammed with $2 million of equipment. US Surgical was so interested in getting us to work with them, they said they would support 90 courses in 18 months, Dr. Say says. In return for exclusive use of some of its products, the company pays the tuition for any vacancies in the 2-day course. Its sales force recruits doctors to take it. And all of these courses that were available varied in length between 1 to 3 days of training, with most providing hands-on experience with the laparoscopic instruments, where, for example, surgeons developed eye-hand coordination first by working with an inanimate model, then stepped up to store-bought chickens. Some courses then provided animal models on which surgeons practiced removing gallbladders laparoscopically. Since pigs were the preferred animal model, pig farmers became unexpected beneficiaries in the rush for training in lap chole. As the Wall Street Journal reported, they essentially rent pigs to courses for a day for $50 to $200 and get them back without their gallbladders to be fattened for market. Courses also varied in the type of exposure trainees received to the technique itself, whether they watched recorded and perhaps edited videos of the procedure or observed lap chole being performed live. As the New York Times later reported, medical experts are concerned that too many surgeons are being trained too fast in courses that vary in length and quality. In some courses, surgeons practice on pigs, whose gallbladder anatomy most closely resembles that of humans. In other courses, no animal work is done. But regardless of how the courses were structured, what often mattered was how surgeons trained in addition to attending a course. According to Jen Armstrong, an ethnographer who attended and studied some of the early training courses, it was clear that after the close of the workshop, surgeons needed to organize their own learning process before performing laparoscopic cholecystectomy on their first human patients. A study at the University of Pennsylvania, however, found that most surgeons who adopted the technique in 1989 and the first quarter of 1990, 35% performed their first lap chole without having previously assisted in one with a more experienced colleague. When performing their first lap chole, 58% of surgeons were not assisted by a more experienced surgeon. The authors of the study suggested that some surgeons did not think to seek additional training because most new surgical procedures are minor variants of existing ones, and specific criteria for granting clinical privileges may not be indicated. But since advances in general surgery were perceived to rarely require substantial retraining, some surgeons emerged from the lap chole courses believing themselves to be immediately ready to conduct the procedure on their own. As Parasa explained, after seeing it done by somebody well-trained, it looked so simple. Some surgeons said, I am able to do this tomorrow because I have done more than 3,000 open cholecystectomies, and I know well the position of everything. This impression was further reinforced by the videos of lap chole that were shown in promotion of the technique, as well as during training courses. For example, according to Olson, for every clip that would actually load and fire properly in these early prototypes, about 4 or 5 would go shooting across the abdomen. But with the magic of editing, we edited that all out. We had the promotional videos edited through to the point of where it was very clear that it was a doable, workable procedure. But the radically different implementation of laparoscopic surgery compared to traditional open surgery created a situation where the general standard of see one, do one, teach one was no longer sufficient. Perhaps more important than the length of a training course or how much hands-on experience it included was for instructors to explicitly tell trainees that attending the course was only the beginning of their training in laparoscopic surgery. As Armstrong observed, one instructor, for example, told attendees, if you have scheduled your first laparoscopic case for next week, cancel it. Trainees needed to be told that before attempting a lap chole on a patient as the primary surgeon, they needed to first spend time working with a team of colleagues to practice using the instruments, as well as assisting in procedures with more experienced surgeons. By mid-1990, both the American College of Surgeons and SAGES were concerned that lap chole would be performed without adequate training. The American College of Surgeons worried that physicians who had training in laparoscopic or endoscopic procedures, but not in open cholecystectomy, such as gynecologists or gastroenterologists, would attempt to perform lap choles. They issued a statement in June 1990 asserting that for optimal quality patient care, laparoscopic cholecystectomy should be performed by surgeons who are qualified to perform open cholecystectomy. Only such surgeons can treat complications consequent to laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Similarly, SAGES issued a statement 2 months earlier on the granting of privileges for laparoscopic general surgery. The statement emphasized that the attendance at short courses that do not provide supervised hands-on training is not an acceptable substitute. It further suggested that it may be desirable that applicants for privileges be proctored by a qualified, unbiased staff surgeon experienced in general and laparoscopic surgery. Though procedural privileges are granted to surgeons at the discretion of individual hospitals, the American College of Surgeons and SAGES leaderships hoped that their statements would have an influential effect and slow the adoption of lap chole. But as we saw, hospitals had a major economic incentive to offer the procedure as quickly as possible. This desire to provide cutting-edge medical services sometimes created a dangerous conflict of interest with regards to a hospital's ability to regulate whether a surgeon should be granted privileges in a new procedure. As the LA Times later explained, since most surgeries require neither national consensus nor government approval, the individual hospital credentialing committees are the only check on what operations doctors can perform. Responding to the increasing number of gallbladder surgery complications, in March 1992, the New York State Health Department announced that it was preparing a warning to hospitals on the provision of lap chole. As the department's spokeswoman told the Poughkeepsie Journal, since the fall of 1990, hospitals throughout New York have reported 128 incidents associated with the laparoscopic procedure, including 6 deaths. According to the New York Times, among the cases of botched surgery that led the state to act was that of a 66-year-old woman who bled to death after a surgeon accidentally punctured her aorta. The surgeon learned the laparoscopic technique in a one-day seminar. In another case, the bowel of a 42-year-old woman was injured. The hospital said it had no information that the surgeon had any training in laparoscopy. The hospital did not establish qualifications for granting credentials for the procedure until 5 months after the surgery. On June 12, 1992, state health officials issued guidelines to New York hospitals stipulating that privileges for lap chole could only be granted to surgeons with experience assisting an already privileged surgeon in at least 5 procedures and performing at least 10 additional procedures as the responsible surgeon under the supervision of an already privileged surgeon. Unlike the 1990 SAGES statement, these guidelines were more specific with regards to the amount of supervised practical experience that surgeons had to have. In response to these state-mandated guidelines, the SAGE's leadership recognized that our guidelines have not been embraced universally, and unfortunate occurrences indicate that more stringent and outside influence credentialing is appropriate. Frederick Green, who I think might be in the audience today, and was the new president of SAGES at the time, and urged that the recent incursion of a state agency for the specific purpose of developing guidelines that mandate hospital credentialing in an operative procedure should arouse all surgeons and serve as a wake-up call. Unless we act responsibly as individuals on our hospital medical staffs, the state and federal governments will take over this activity for us. The May 1990 guidelines, thus, were judged to be vague and insufficient, and a more detailed statement was approved by SAGES in October 1992. The additional recommendations included that surgeons should have experience as a first assistant to a surgeon already privileged in a laparoscopic procedure and have been proctored by an experienced laparoscopic surgeon. And so what I gather from this research is that although much of the early concern over proper training and the emergence of lap chole was directed towards the structure of the training courses, the inclusion of more specific requirements for post-course training by both SAGES and the New York State Health Department suggests that it was the ways in which surgeons trained after attending a course that was often more crucial for preventing complications than the courses themselves. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that was meaningful and interesting for most of you.
Thanks very much. Absolutely delightful. You know, for us, we're all surgeons, of course. The fact that you're this interested in something we do, we think is terrific.
It's a fascinating story.
I'm going to start by asking a question. And again, as a reminder to everybody, if you look on your prompts, you'll see there's a place to type in a question, and we'll try to retrieve those and get those to Cynthia. There wasn't one question that was typed in halfway through your talk. Did you discover anybody else who alleged to have done a lap chole earlier than the folks you talked about? Because people have said so-and-so had done one earlier and it was never recorded, and in various parts of Europe. And did you read anything about that or find anybody who thought somebody had done one earlier?
Yeah, I've heard multiple stories. I tend to stick to this narrative just because it's the most straightforward for my talks. But some people give credit to Eric Mua, who did a lap chole, but some people might dispute whether it was actually a lap chole because it wasn't necessarily using the same technique as using trocars and laparoscopic instruments. I think he might have used laparoscopic instruments, but they were through, I think he called it a galloscope, and it was about, it held the incision open about that wide. And so it was kind of more like doing a mini laparotomy cholecystectomy, but possibly using laparoscopic instruments. So there's some dispute about that.
Great. Other people, are there any questions? Let's see, there's one question that just came up. What else did you find out about the laser? You know, those of us who participated in this sort of all got laser training, and which we used for about 5 cases, then threw it away. And we had a lot of very expensive lasers sitting around the operating room. Nobody was using them anymore. What was did you do any work on looking at what happened to the laser and how that got started and what happened to it?
Well, the story that I've been told about how laser laparoscopic cholecystectomy came about was that it was kind of designed as a way for laser instrument manufacturers to expand their market base. And so, yeah, they were very interested in having people use the lasers, but as you said, many people found that the laser wasn't actually better than just using an electrocautery. And that quickly, I guess, went away. But it was also kind of a marketing technique for hospitals, because you could market it as, you know, laser surgery, Star Wars surgery, or it made for some great headlines, I think.
Other questions, please type them in. I'm trying to retrieve them as I go.
Yeah, Dr. Nakayama had a question about what information you use that came specifically from the ACS archives.
For this chapter of my thesis, it was mostly about the 1989 Clinical Congress, and also the statement that was put out. But other than that, there wasn't much mention of lap chole in the actual minutes. I think what happened was that SAGES really took the lead in doing this, and I think the college was busy doing other things at the time. So a lot was taken over by SAGES.
So you mean this little talk is not your entire thesis? I'm shocked.
This is half a chapter.
Half a chapter. How many chapters for your thesis?
It's at 4 chapters.
But that's nice. Very good. When do you defend?
I hope to submit in the next couple weeks, and then have a defense date in December.
Well, let us know if you need any help. Some of us can go and show up.
Thank you.
One final question from Dr. McGinnis. Overall lessons about surgical training. As a layperson reading through this must all come as a shock, right? That you never imagined that an entire world would adopt a new procedure with very little training. What's your sense about it as a non-surgeon?
I think there was a lot of hype built around it in the early days, and that's actually in chapter 3, where I talk about this as being a result of changing judicial attitudes towards antitrust law, and how they apply to professions. So that's actually a really interesting story as well, because then in the 80s, we also saw an increase of advertising and self-promotion. So that by the time we get to 1989 and 1990, there was an explosion of promotion and publicity for lap choline that really drove that patient demand that apparently caused a lot of surgeons to take up the technique. And that was also a very interesting story to see.
Well, thanks again. I apologize to Dr. Green. I'm going to have to move on. He is on the call today. I'm going to move on to the next lecture in an effort to stay on time. So, Cynthia, good luck with your dissertation, and we look forward to seeing the rest of your publications about this.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right, our keynote speaker is Dr. Craig Miller. Dr. Miller is a surgeon in Columbus, Ohio, practices out of Riverside Hospital in Columbus. Has previously written a book about the Big Z, Dr. Zollinger, which he told us the story the other day about how research for that book led to this topic. So today's keynote address is Through a Distant Lens, the images of the life of Dr. Michael DeBakey. Dr. Miller. Is he still muted? Megan.
Good evening. Now can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pappas, for that very kind introduction. And I hope everybody's got their coffee and donuts for the breakfast talk. As he just mentioned, it was a great privilege of mine to give this same talk 5 years ago in San Francisco at the release of my book, then published by the college, on the life of Dr. Zollinger. And now we're going to move on to my subsequent project, which is a biography of Dr. Michael DeBakey. Let's see, I don't think I quite have control. Yeah, maybe I do. This is the book. It's been released by Oxford University Press this year. It's entitled A Time for All Things. It's been my great privilege for the last few years to work on this, primarily under the auspices of a fellowship that was administered through the National Library of Medicine. I encourage everybody, if you don't already know about it in this group, to research that, because the DeBakey Foundation has established a research fellowship at the National Library of Medicine that is providing funding for fundamental research into medical history in the United States and elsewhere. I decided for this talk to focus on two things. First of all, to make it primarily a visual presentation because of the nature of what we're dealing with right now, but also to focus on the early part of Dr. DeBakey's life, the part that may be less well known to most of you. So we're going to begin at the beginning. This is a photograph of his parents, Shakir and Rahija DeBakey, a photograph taken right around 1910. They both hailed from Jedidin, Marjane in Lebanon, which was then part of Ottoman Syria when they were born, right around 1880, 1885. The dates are a little bit nebulous. They were both Maronite Christians. One of the interesting things about these two is that, as far as we can tell, and based on family tradition as well, they did not actually know each other as they were growing up in Lebanon, and they met here in the United States years later, met and subsequently married. Both of them emigrated to the US right around the turn of the 20th century, and we can get a little bit more precise than just that. This is a photograph of Rahija and her cousin Martha, probably taken in Beirut in 1898 as they were embarking on their trip to come to the United States. This is the manifest of their immigration at Ellis Island. They arrived in New York on August 7th, 1898. Dr. DeBakey's father, Shakir, arrived a little bit later. There are some conflicting data points regarding that, but I believe this particular document here is the most likely to be accurate. This is Shakir DeBakey's application for a passport in 1921 for himself and his family, and on this passport application he indicates that he sailed from Beirut, then Syria, about February 14th, 1901. So that puts him in the US a couple of years after his future wife Rahija arrived. And we know from, again, family history and his own recollections that he began life in the United States as a peddler, and quite a common occupation for Middle Eastern immigrants at the time. And by 1907, he had alighted in Lake Charles, Louisiana. By all accounts, Shakir DeBakey was an outstanding businessman, and he quickly accumulated a significant amount of money, even as a peddler with just a wagon. So Shakir and Rahija meet, again, this is according to a family tradition, in Oklahoma, which had a large population of immigrants from that part of the world, about 1907. They got married, and we do know that on September 7th, 1908, this fellow was born, Michael DeBakey. Of course, every time I project this image, I remind everyone that whenever one thinks of Dr. DeBakey, this is the first picture that comes to mind. He's about 2. I believe it's pretty clear that that picture of DeBakey was taken at the same time as the portrait of his parents. By 1910, they had bought their own storefront home in Lake Charles. As I mentioned, Shakir DeBakey was a successful businessman, and this is an interesting example during my research of his intellect and his ambition. This is a photograph of Shakir DeBakey. I identified this in the National Library of Medicine in the DeBakey archives there, but I was confused for a few years as to what exactly he was proudly looking over. Obviously something of his own construction, but what in the world was this? By the time this photograph was taken, he probably had at least 4 or 5 children, so it occurred to me this is some sort of plaything. But a year or two ago, Dr. DeBakey's son, Dennis, sent me a cache of documents, one of which was this, which is an awarded patent to Shakir DeBakey for a home store. And associated with that document was this one, a drawing, which I immediately recognized as the same model that was present in this photograph of Dr. DeBakey's father. So what this is Shakir DeBakey's model for a home store. And if you read through, what would happen is you would come through the front door, pick up a cart, and then take the cart through the store on these rails and pick out what you wanted. Then you'd go out at the end of the store. No wandering around. There was a specific defined pathway for you. This is a map of part of Lake Charles in the early 20th century, and I don't know if you can see it on your screens or not, but it actually marks out in numbers the buildings that were owned by the DeBakey family during the time that Dr. DeBakey was growing up in Lake Charles. Number 1 here is their first house, which was that storefront that I mentioned. It turns out to have been at 1004 Railroad Avenue. The railroad was running right through here. They were living on Railroad Avenue. And as that store became more and more successful, Shakir DeBakey bought more property, built several stores on this block, and eventually owned the entire block front onto Railroad Avenue with 3 other buildings. Years later, they moved into the most affluent neighborhood in Lake Charles, which was down here, and we'll indicate that here shortly. This is the 1910 census showing that they were at 1004 Railroad Avenue, and at that point you had these people who were living in the house. I have no idea yet why Shakir is mentioned as, it looks like Marguar here. His middle name was Marcus, or the middle name that he used, his father's first name. This is Rahija, obviously. Young Michael was 2 years old at the time. His brother, Ernest, who was just a few months old, and then here's Rahija's mother, Helena Zarba, who also lived with the family. This is one of the buildings on Railroad Avenue that Shakir DeBakey built in 1914. You can probably just barely see it on the front of this building here. This was a building that lasted for many decades, several generations, in fact, as a drugstore, and was eventually razed sometime in the late 1990s. There's another building right next to it, in which you can actually see the DeBakey name and the year of its construction, 1920. Unfortunately, all of those buildings, in fact, every one of the buildings that Dr. DeBakey would have recognized from his childhood now no longer stand in Lake Charles. This is what that block of Railroad Avenue looks like, only the stoops remain. Over the next few years after the birth of their first son, the DeBakeys had 5 other children, and here they all are in what I believe is the only photograph of the entire family that's extant. He was followed, was Michael, by his brother Ernest 2 years later. Ernest, of course, would go on to become a very successful surgeon of his own, on his own, primarily in Mobile, Alabama. The first daughter was named Goldie. She's down here at the bottom. Selena at the top left was born a year later. Selma, 1915, and Lois in 1920. Of course, some of us may remember Selma and Lois giving their talks at the Clinical Congress of the College of Surgeons regarding what they consider to be transgressions in good English that were promulgated by physicians. It was very amusing. Of course, as you might expect, young Michael DeBakey was an excellent student. May not necessarily expect that he was also an excellent athlete. Here's a clipping from the local newspaper showing that in the 50-yard dash, young Michael DeBakey in this citywide track meet took first place. He was also involved in other sports such as baseball, from which he received an injury where he nearly lost an eye, but also in competitive gardening, which is something that sadly has gone by the wayside. And he was very competitive as a competitive gardener, including winning first place in another citywide competition from which he won several different prizes. His brother Ernest made third place there. DeBakey remained interested in gardening throughout his life, as opposed to his brother, who said he never wanted to garden again after that contest. Obviously, it's a photograph of young Michael. So as I mentioned, Shakir's businesses were quite successful. I also showed you earlier the passport from 1921. That passport was applied for so that they could go on what was really an epic trip for the time. They went overseas to France and then to the Middle East. And in fact, the whole family went and they visited Shakir and Rahijah's birthplace at Jeddah Marjaon. Give some idea of Shakir's largesse by this time. They took their car with them. This was the house they built in what's called the Carpenter District there in Lake Charles, where they lived in. I'm not sure that they built it. They may well have purchased it. DeBakey remembered this with nostalgia later in life. This next picture is taken from the porch of the side of that house, which is at 1005 Broad Street, showing their vegetable garden. There were gardens on each side of the house. And this one gives you another indication of the level of commitment that the family had towards gardening. I've got quite a haul here. If you zoom in from left to right, there's Ernest, who even in his body language indicates he's not particularly interested in what he's doing. Michael, who I put in the inset there, and then Shakir. As I mentioned, none of the buildings that Michael DeBakey would have remembered from this time period remains standing, including this one. But the house behind, on the other side of the street from where the garden was, is still standing. And here's Dr. DeBakey in the 1970s going back to visit the site, standing just a few feet from where he was in this photograph, probably from around 1920. Some other old photographs of interest. He was a member of the Boy Scout troop, and this is them at what they called the old swimming hole. There's a very young Michael DeBakey. Most of these photographs, of course, have never been published before, if you've even seen. This is Dr. DeBakey as a high school senior playing saxophone with the Lake Charles High School band. And this is the program of his high school's commencement in May of 1926. We zoom in a little bit, and we can see that he was valedictorian of his class, one of two. He shared that title with one Ruby Raines, and we can see that he was also on the program for entertainment, playing the vaudeville tune Laughin' Sacks alongside two other players, including one of his best friends, who was Morris Hines, affectionately known as Pee-wee. Following his graduation from high school, DeBakey applied and was accepted at Tulane University. You can see, I hope you can see this on your screens, that his major course was pre-medical. And in those days, just as we have in some institutions now, Tulane had a 6-year accelerated medical school course consisting of 2 years of undergraduate study followed by a traditional 4 years of medical school. And after 2 years of medical school, having completed 4 full years of the undergraduate curriculum, the student would be awarded his baccalaureate degree, then 2 years later his medical degree. The other interesting thing from this application is the fact that a semester at Tulane then cost a cold $90. I don't know exactly what it costs right now, but I suspect it's probably more than that. This is the dormitory building. He was in the LaSalle dormitory, where Dr. DeBakey lived as a freshman. In his subsequent years, he lived in private houses, rented rooms, and with some friends we'll talk about in a minute. This building, its dormitory building, is actually still standing. It's an administrative building now. And here he is in front of Gibson Hall, which is the main old building of Tulane, fronting St. Charles Avenue. Of course, it's still standing too. And then some other images from that time period. These are all, according to the archivists at Tulane, they believe these all, well, this one's easy to tell, all were taken at Audubon Park, which is across the street from Tulane on the other side of St. Charles. Not all was schoolwork and nose to the grindstone, though. This is a photograph taken somewhere in the bayou, one would guess, of Michael DeBakey on the far right here. This may be his brother Ernest, but I'm not certain of that, so I'm not going to make any suppositions. These two individuals, though, are almost certainly the Odom brothers, and this is one of them, Charles Odom. He's the one who's sitting down here with the pipe. And this, of course, is Dr. DeBakey. Again, when everyone thinks of Dr. DeBakey, this is another image that must immediately come to mind. These two fellows play a large role, really, in DeBakey's early story. On the right, we have Charles Odom, who will go on to become a general surgeon at Charity Hospital in Tulane, and his brother Guy, who will become a very prominent neurosurgeon in academic circles. Actually, that's the family I mentioned that Dr. DeBakey lived with during his medical school period. At least for several months, he lived with the Odoms. So, undergraduate, there's a photograph from those days. When DeBakey arrived, he was used to getting perfect scores. It would be an unusual situation where he got anything less than a perfect score while he was at Lake Charles High School. But he found in his first semester at Tulane that wasn't necessarily going to be the case as he moved up a level. He admitted later on that he spent a little bit too much time in the French Quarter, and even though he didn't drink at all, by his recollection, he did enjoy listening to the jazz. He was mortified when he got this grade report, and so were his parents. After that, he went to the Quarter no more, as he put it, and concentrated completely on schooling and on sublimating his extracurricular activities, such as joining the Tulane University stage and marching bands. Here he is playing the saxophone. The next course, he did considerably better, as we can see here, with this renewed focus. This is a picture that I just find interesting. I'm not entirely sure I don't have a clue as to where it was taken. I'm not entirely sure when, but I believe that it was taken probably around 1929. There's mention in the gossip column of the local Lake Charles newspaper that the star pupil, Michael, who's now a medical student at Tulane, is coming through on a summer break, and that he's going to go with his friend out west on a driving trip. I have not encountered any interviews or mention of him, by Dr. DeBakey, of this subsequently, but this photograph certainly seems to be a likely candidate for one of such a sojourn. I think this is very amusing to see what's written on the roof of the car. True love never runs smoothly. In fact, this is important because even before this, probably primarily before this as a teenager, young Michael used to take apart his father's cars, and it became such an annoyance to Shakir that finally he gave Michael and Ernest a car, not so much to drive, but to take it apart so that they wouldn't tinker with his own functional cars. And that had some practical importance going forward. So after 2 years in purely undergraduate curriculum, he starts at the medical school at Tulane. This was the building, Richardson Hall, of course it's still there. This at the time was the medical school for the first 2 years before one would complete their clinical education at Charity Hospital and the affiliated buildings downtown. This is DeBakey's first medical school grade card from his first term. And it may be difficult to see on your screens, hopefully not, but the most salient number that we see here, I think, is, and I'll blow it up here, is his score in minor surgery, which was 71. This is by far the lowest score that he had in medical school, and in fact, the lowest score that he ever got at any time in Tulane. When one looks over the course description, minor surgery is really not doesn't give the proper indication of what this course was about. This we would call more an introduction to surgery. His grade on it wasn't nearly as important as the interest that was generated by the instructor in the course, and that was this gentleman, Edward Alton Oxner. Oxner was relatively new to Tulane himself. He'd just taken over for the legendary Rudolph Mattis a couple of years before, but he was, by all accounts, a very energetic and fascinating character. DeBakey immediately took to him, and Oxner became his mentor and role model for really the rest of Oxner's life. So a few yearbook pictures as we wrap things up in these undergraduate and medical school years. As I mentioned, he completed his college after 4 years, so graduates with a bachelor degree. In that same yearbook, he's listed as just an ordinary medical student. 2 years later, he finishes medical school and wears the mortarboard again. Influenced, as I mentioned, by Oxner, he becomes an intern at the charity hospital, and Oxner takes him under his wing, as does Rudolph Mattis, who is, as I mentioned, a legend in surgery, certainly worldwide surgery. Don't have enough time to get into him today, but DeBakey becomes, as I mentioned, a trainee in surgery at the charity hospital and the other affiliated hospitals in New Orleans. While there, one of the first things that he does is develop this device, which is a transfusion syringe. In those days, of course, transfusion was a very primitive thing, both from a biochemical standpoint and from a physical surgical standpoint. Oftentimes the procedure was done in the operating room. Of course, transfusion reactions were not unusual. It was a whole terrible technical bloody mess. And while he was an intern and even a senior medical student, DeBakey observed some of these procedures and said, oh my gosh, there's got to be a better way than that. So drawing on some of the knowledge that he had obtained from taking apart one of his father's cars, he developed this, which is a sleeve valve transfusion syringe. A sleeve valve, as I won't go into detail because I don't have the time, but a sleeve valve is a type of internal combustion engine that was popular in several cars during the early period of automotive engineering. And he basically stole the idea to create a transfusion syringe that could be easily operated and was much cleaner. It was only a couple years after that that he developed an even more innovative method of doing transfusions, or improved upon it. Really, there's some legend about the DeBakey roller pump that needs to be clarified. Dr. DeBakey did not invent the roller pump. It had been around for a considerable period of time before he came onto the scene. What he did, and it's clearly demonstrated in this photograph, which actually shows him himself holding one of his roller pumps, is two things. His roller pump had two rollers in a C-shaped outer dimension, and the importance of this is that as one rotated this with the hand crank, at any given time, one of the rollers would be compressing this tubing so that it functioned as a valve. For that reason, if when we're constructing a physiologic model of arterial blood flow and we didn't want to have a valve because it would disrupt things, you didn't need it with his. There would always be flow only in one direction, whichever direction you cranked this. The major thing, though, is demonstrated right here, which is the flange that he put on the tubing. As he started to work with roller pumps for an experimental project, he noticed that as you turned the roller pump, the tubing would get caught by friction and start just advancing forward, being milked forward by the function of the hand crank. So pretty soon you'd end up with a whole bunch of tubing down here, hardly anything up here, and it was an untenable position. His solution was to develop tubing with a flange on it and then a C-clamp that could be clamped down onto the flange, which eliminated that problem. And he was awarded a patent for that, his first patent. Several years later, in 1939, at the AMA meeting, which used to be a big deal, he just simply had a desk with his device on it and a display model, really. And next to him was a fellow from the East Coast called John Gibbon, who also had his display demonstrating his prototypes for a cardiopulmonary bypass machine, which he'd been working on for a number of years. He had, at that point, used what we called finger cot pumps to pump the blood along, which required him having to have valves, as you can see in this drawing. Well, DeBakey said, I can beat that. Take a look at this thing. When they both got back to their home institutions, DeBakey sent Gibbon one of his roller pumps, and by later in the year, and although the font has been changed by subsequent people, this is the original artwork for a paper by Gibbon later that same year, in which he's replaced the finger cot pumps with these DeBakey roller pumps. And in fact, as the years passed, and eventually many years later, he came up with a workable, functioning cardiopulmonary bypass machine. You can see the DeBakey rollers on top of it. He gave full credit to Gibbon. Well, Dr. DeBakey was obviously quite the star as a trainee, producing these things as well as being excellent on his clinical rotations. And Ochsner determined that he needed to get more wide-ranging training. For that reason, he arranged for DeBakey to head to Europe for some specialized training, particularly in vascular and thoracic surgery. The primary component of this would be a program with Professor René Lariche, who was the famous French professor. Before DeBakey got to the University of Strasbourg, where Lariche was, though, he spent 2 weeks in Paris in the company of this young lady here. This was Diana Cooper, sometimes called Dolly in her youth, who was a floor nurse at Charity Hospital, where DeBakey got to know her and developed a budding romance. At this time, she had actually gotten to France before he did and was working at the American Hospital in Paris. The story is that this was all completely random, and nobody has ever been able to prove otherwise, but it was a nice coincidence, certainly. The relationship continued to bud from there. In those 2 weeks in Paris, we have a number of interesting photographs. We know from DeBakey's diary, which he kept during this time period, that they did the usual sort of touristy things. They went to the Folies Bergère, to the Hotel Ritz, and on his 27th birthday, they climbed, as he counted them, 367 steps to the top of the Cathedral Notre Dame, where he took a photograph of Diana with the pigeons and the gargoyles. When he made it over to Strasbourg after those 2 weeks, this is where DeBakey lived, at the Pension Elise at 12 Rue Goethe in Strasbourg. And he was there to work with this fellow here, Professor René Lariche. Lariche was the master of sympathectomy at that time, which was the primary vascular operation for arterial occlusive disease, since in the future things such as endarterectomy and bypass were still lying. In fact, two of the people who were the main pioneers of those techniques are in this photograph and were also trainees, what they called assistants étrangers. Here's Dr. DeBakey in the center, but over his left shoulder we see João Cid dos Santos, the Portuguese, who would do the first successful clinical use of thromboendarterectomy shortly after World War II. And then in the bottom right here is Jean Gunlin, who would be the first to perform successful femoral popliteal bypass graft while working in Lariche's service in Paris a few years after Dos Santos' great pioneering work. So quite a crew there. And here's some of the photographs of time outside of the hospital with DeBakey and Lariche and some other of the trainees. From there, DeBakey went at the arrangement of Ochsner to Martin Kirchner, who was at the University of Heidelberg at this point in time and was one of the world's leading thoracic surgeons. He had done the first, the so-called Trendelenburg operation, pulmonary embolectomy, first successful one, and had also become famous for a number of other different things. One of the first to approach trauma in a scientific way. Of course, Kirschner wires are still prevalent in orthopedics, and he's the namesake. There's a photograph of DeBakey with two young women we'll get into in a second at the Heidelberg Castle. Here's Kirschner again. Very different person from Lariche. Both of them were very skilled clinicians and academicians, but totally different styles. In Lariche's clinic, people would sort of start operating sometime around 9 o'clock, take a long 4 or 5 hour lunch, dinner break, and then come back for work for a couple more hours. Kirschner could never have done that. Kirschner's clinic started with an X-ray conference at 7 a.m. and there was no excuse whatsoever, including death of the spouse, according to legend. As DeBakey reported, everyone was scared to death of him. And even though DeBakey had a great deal of affection for Lariche, the sort of laissez-faire and disorganization did not appeal to him, at least not in the way that Kirschner's very efficient and organized service did. I think we can see which one he internalized and then later applied in his own circumstance when given the opportunity. This is an interesting photograph here, DeBakey with the young woman. She's one of the two that we saw at the Heidelberg Castle. This has been mislabeled in past publication, including by the National Library of Medicine. It's been indicated this is a photograph of DeBakey with his wife or future wife, Diana, at a restaurant or cafe in France. I think those two facts are both wrong. This is not Diana, this is somebody else. And if we look closely, we can tell that this is not French, this is German. And it will all come together here momentarily. There's some other photographs of him with this woman. You'll recognize perhaps this is the other woman from that Heidelberg Castle's photograph, so we can assume that this gentleman probably took the picture. This is another fellow trainee of DeBakey's with Kirschner called Ernst Schanz. And Schanz and DeBakey were friends. Schanz spoke very good English, had spent some time in London just before coming to Heidelberg, and he owned his own car. For all those reasons, DeBakey and Schanz became good friends. This Schanz apparently had a different car. This looks like a BMW, but I mentioned that he did have a car. Here's yet another photograph in Heidelberg, DeBakey and this young woman. It's not Diana Cooper. We have to wonder, of course, boys being boys, what exactly is going on here, but it's actually all on the up and up. I do have some letters from the 1930s in which DeBakey, writing home, mentions that he was visited in Germany by Veda Odom. You remember the Odom family? We had Gus and Charlie earlier. She's the younger sister of the two of them. She definitely had a romantic interest in DeBakey, and both families were in favor of it. But DeBakey apparently did not feel the same way, and nothing moved forward on that front. So I suspected that this was Veda Odom with no proof at all. So I found this picture in the, if we can get it to come up here. It's not advancing. Control over the slides. There we go. Oh, too fast. Okay. Veda Odom as a cheerleader. She actually led a pretty interesting life herself. She married a successful attorney in New Orleans, and she was present in Honolulu on December 7th, 1941, so she got to witness the attack on Pearl Harbor firsthand. She survived it, and there's now a scholarship in law school at Tulane that bears her name. I think I might have a slow connection now, if we could move the slides forward. So we come to this picture, which is one of those when we're doing research that just takes your breath away. When you look at what looks like Veda Odom, Dr. DeBakey, and a Nazi officer, SS no less. That's Schanz, and Schanz was a member of the Nazi Party at that time. Last fall, there was a minor cause célèbre when a blogger found out from an interview from Dr. DeBakey from 1972 that he had assisted in some sterilization procedures while he was a resident at the Heidelberg Clinic, and this is the case. He never made a secret about it. He explained exactly what transpired, and I will now too. They were doing a large number of sterilization operations, and he mentioned this to Sean, saying, we don't do this that much at home. What's going on? And Sean's told him, according to DeBakey, with a little bit of embarrassment, that these operations were actually decided on by a judicial tribunal, and they were not the choice of the patients themselves. They were instead based on abstruse legal criteria. And at that point, he was getting ready to leave anyway, but DeBakey then separated himself entirely from the entire process and would have nothing to do with it going forward, recognizing that it was clearly something that was wrong. I go into this in detail in my biography because it deserves it. Well, DeBakey and Diana came back from Europe together in September of 1936 on the luxury liner of the Bremen, one of the best in the world at the time. And a few weeks later, they got married. So upshot of DeBakey's time in Europe, he spent a year there overall, 8 months with Lariche, learning the current vascular surgery techniques, which is primarily sympathectomy, then 4 months in Heidelberg with Kirchner, learning thoracic surgery. He also honed his research skills and developed methods of efficiency and organization, especially with Kirchner. Returned to the US, as I mentioned, in September. This is the telegram from Oxner congratulating him on his marriage. And then shortly thereafter, well, a significant period of time thereafter, their son Michael was born. This is a fun picture. They're all DeBakey and Diana. And then this is Dean Eccles, a neurosurgeon who was at the Oxner Clinic later, but this time at Tulane. They're all holding baby bottles. And according to John Oxner, told me the story of this picture, this is in celebration of Diana's pregnancy. And those are full of whiskey. Michael, who was universally known as Mickey, and is still with us in Peru, South America. This is him about a year old with DeBakey and Rahija, his mother. And then here's Ernest, DeBakey's brother, with a somewhat older Mickey and again Rahija. I'm going to briefly touch on some clinical things because after all, that's of some importance. DeBakey wrote, along with Oxner, about 40 papers during the 1930s, the most important of which were on liver and subdiaphragmatic abscesses, which are still almost always quoted in any paper that's written about those topics. And then this one, which of course is of some significance and interest to the community at large, the idea being promulgated by them here that the increase in smoking with the universal custom of inhaling is probably a responsible factor for the development of lung cancer. That is from SGO. That was actually from a clinical congress presentation from 1938, I believe. And then this is from an AMA presentation a year or two later, where they're demonstrating as best they could the correlation between lung cancer incidence and tobacco production. Since they didn't have any data on smoking, this is the closest they could get to it from the US government. The reason why automobile production is on there, some people had also forwarded the idea that the increase in lung cancer was due to exhaust from development of great enumeration of motor vehicles in the 1920s and post-war period. This is to thwart that concept. DeBakey became assistant professor October of 1940. And then in January of 42, with Alton Oxner and Rudolf Mattis, Mims Gage, and a real wrecking crew of superstars, starts up the Oxner Clinic. This is January of 42. Of course, the month before, something else of some significance had happened. Somewhere in that picture, I suppose, is Veda Odom off in the distance. At the start of World War II, several of the important surgeons on the Tulane staff went off to, including Mims Gage and others, went off to join the war effort. DeBakey very strongly wanted to do so too. He's very patriotic, and he and his parents felt that they owed the country a great deal. Oxner wouldn't let him at first, so he participated in the college's war sessions, which were sort of like a reintroduction to trauma and wound care that were a road show across the country throughout those early months. before the surgeons and other physicians ended up in the actual active service. But DeBakey finally got his way, and in the fall, Ochsner allowed him to enlist. He became captain, was assigned to the Army Air Force Hospital in Gulfport, Mississippi, not that far certainly from New Orleans. The Gulfport field was primarily involved in training of engineers for repairing warplanes. So DeBakey didn't do very much from a clinical perspective. Higher ups knew, though, about him from those 40 papers and from whispers, no doubt, from Ochsner. And he ended up instead in the Army Surgeon General's office by the first of the year, where his real war work began to come to fruition. This was the building where the surgical consultants met. The surgical consultants worked underneath the Army Surgeon General, and these were some of their tasks. They would collect and analyze all the data that was compiled in the Army regarding medical care. This was a small office with just a few officers. What they were able to accomplish, even that, what I just mentioned to you, seems almost overwhelming, but it was only the beginning. They also coordinated with the National Research Council regarding clinical research into antibiotics, transfusions, all the other things that the NRC was involved in. There were a lot of them. They also reviewed all the medical articles and publications that were produced by any of the Army Medical Corps members, and also wrote, and this was DeBakey primarily because he was the best writer, he wrote policy directives and speeches for a number of important figures, including the Surgeon General of the Army. And as important as anything, played a role in assigning the physicians' equipment and supplies to all the hospital units in the U.S. Army. DeBakey later said he worked as hard when he was in the Army as he ever worked in his life. Much of the research work he did was at this building called the Army Medical Library, which is a beautiful collection, one of the world's great medical libraries, but in a lousy building. In the years to come, DeBakey would be one of the main figures who would be responsible for converting this to the National Library of Medicine that we now cherish. I'm running out of time here a little bit, but let me move very quickly. One of the most important things that he worked on that ended up having no impact whatsoever, tragically, was trench foot. In 1943, before it had become a significant factor for the armed forces, DeBakey published this treatment of the topic and a warning dating all the way back to Napoleon and Napoleon's Surgeon General Ray, who described the problem of trench foot, and then of course the British experience in World War I, and in fact going on to say the American experience in World War I, where a lot of lessons were learned about how to prevent the problem, and he indicated exactly how you would go about preventing the problem, and it was completely ignored. In the subsequent Italian campaign that winter, one trench foot casualty was reported for every 4 that was received from combat wounds. Well, you'd think that that would be enough to learn the lesson, but not at all. Here is subsequent warning number 2 in the summer of 1944, where he actually says, look, I've warned you once, here's what you got to do to prevent it. It was again ignored, and in the European campaign in 44 and 45, 45,000 cases of trench foot. And that, from that initial image I showed you, obviously that's an amputation that's going to happen bilaterally, but this was not just a sore toe. Many, if not most of the soldiers who suffered from this were permanently rendered hors de combat, and many of them required amputations and lived altered lives as a result of this. Well, towards the end of the war, DeBakey finally got a chance to go over to actually inspect the U.S. Army facilities in person, and that is the subject of this memorandum. And I wish I had time to go over this in a little bit more detail, but this is very interesting. When he flew over to Europe, he was given this dollar bill, which is still extant in the National Library of Medicine. This is called a short snorter. And that was a bill that was given to someone who was making their first transatlantic or transoceanic flight. All of the people who were also on that flight would sign it, and then you had to carry it with you. And if you encountered any one of these people in any scenario, if you didn't have the short snorter dollar bill with you, you had to buy drinks. It's interesting in and of itself, and also because it shows the route that he took from Newfoundland to the Azores to Casablanca and the date. but also the people who have signed this. Here we have Edward Churchill, who was, of course, we have the Churchill Lecture now in the Excelsior Society. And Churchill was the chief of surgery at Massachusetts General, and at this time he was the chief surgical consultant for the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. We have Richard Meiling, who was involved in the development of air transport of casualties and later became the dean of the College of Medicine at High State University, my and Dr. Pappas's alma mater. Also, we have Howard Rusk, Perrin Long. These are people involved in physical medicine, early rehabilitation of soldiers, one of the first times this was used. Long was involved in the development of antibiotics. This is Charles Cooper, who was on the board at AT&T and also was the chairman of the board at Columbia Presbyterian in New York at the time. So he's meeting and getting to know some pretty heavy hitters on this trip. We'll move pretty quickly through this. As he was inspecting these, he spent his first time with Churchill, who was a good friend of his by this time. And they were in Florence in order and had the opportunity while they were in Florence of witnessing the 10th Mountain Division's legendary assault on the German position, successful assault at Mount Belvedere, one of the more dramatic episodes of World War II. He was also present at the Remagen Bridge, which was, there we go, was the bridge that the Germans inadvertently left open over the Rhine during their retreat. They failed to destroy it. And DeBakey was there the day after it was captured, and in fact he crossed over into the town on pontoon bridges and helped treat the POWs and also the wounded German soldiers in the hospitals at the town. As impressive as these, though, we get back to an old friend, because this is, of course, General George S. Patton Jr. In command of the 3rd Army. And when DeBakey went to inspect the hospital facilities of the 3rd Army, the chief surgical consultant for that unit was none other than Charlie Odom, his old friend and Veda Odom's older brother. So Charlie Odom was very close with General Patton, and he told DeBakey, well, if you're going to come to the 3rd Army, don't stay in some tent in a bivouac. Stay with the general and me, and you can stay in luxury. And this is where he happened to be, since Patton had a predilection for finding castles and things like that to stay in. This was the one that they were at, which is actually a retirement home, unbelievably enough, but it's called the Fondation Pescator in Luxembourg City. This is where he got to know Patton for a week and was very impressed, actually. He said Patton was not what you had been led to believe. He was very intelligent. He was a scholar of military history. By the way, in the movie Patton, there's the famous scene where he reads the prayer for good weather. It was written by his chaplain. That episode occurred during the week that DeBakey was there at the foundation. A couple other things of interest. These are DeBakey's PX cards, which I think are pretty interesting to look at. This is the one from the Mediterranean Theater and the one from the European Theater. And we see that he eschewed alcohol, never got the beer ration that he could have gotten. Didn't ever get a soft drink ration, but he did get the candy rations, and he also got his smoking ration. So if Oxner had ever seen this, I'm sure he would have been horrified. Something I need to touch on is the auxiliary surgical groups. These were a development from the late 1920s, not something that came about during the war, but they certainly came to their fruition then. These are largely thought of as the precursors to the MASH units, and in a sense they were. What they were surgical groups that were used almost as reserve military units would be used to plug gaps in a line. They were used to plug gaps in the surgical care that could be delivered at a particular point on that battle line. They were composed of surgical specialists, thoracic surgeons, neurosurgeons, and the like, and they would stay behind the main field hospitals and wait for a particular set of casualties where they would be more needed than in another sector. So when you see, especially online, you'll see things about Dr. DeBakey, Legion of Honor for his work with the auxiliary surgical groups. Yeah, the Legion of Honor, his award doesn't specifically state that. And really everyone who was a surgical consultant won that award. More importantly, you get from online discussions you get and presentations, you get the wrong idea. I think, in fact, a diametrically wrong idea that Dr. DeBakey was, he was awarded that because he invented the auxiliary surgical groups, which subsequently became the MASH units. But no, he did not invent the auxiliary surgical groups. His job, as I mentioned earlier, was to provide them with the personnel and the equipment that they would need. That was a big job, don't get me wrong, but he did not initiate the auxiliary surgical groups. And at the end of the war, there was a fight between the civilian elements of the medical corps and the military ones. The military ones wanted to fold the auxiliary surgical groups into their regular field hospital units, which was exactly what ended up happening. That is the MASH unit. The civilian physicians, including Churchill and DeBakey and many others, fought very hard to prevent that happening. So, and Dr. DeBakey was in fact the actual mouthpiece for that at several meetings at the Pentagon, arguing against it. I think this settles the matter right here. It's a letter from DeBakey to Churchill. While DeBakey was still in the Army, Churchill had been mustered out. But we'll just read this sentence together. Attached herewith is a copy of TONE, which is the organizational chart 8571 on the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, which was authorized despite our vigorous protest. Certainly, this is an example of official blindness to facts bathed in the bright light of experience. So I hope that that my book, if it does nothing else, will settle that issue. He certainly deserves, does Dr. DeBakey, the utmost respect and admiration for his war performance, because it really was deserving of all those accolades. But the MASH unit thing needs to be removed because that's not accurate. He stayed in the Army for 1 full year afterwards, helping with care for those wounded who were not ready to be sent back into civilian life. Of course, everybody at the end of the war wanted to get back to be civilians themselves, but there were many surgeons, or patients rather, former soldiers at the stateside hospitals who had suffered burns, vascular injuries, things of that nature, who were not ready to be returned to civilian life. And he stayed in the Army primarily for that reason, to make sure that their care remained coordinated. And he convinced some 100 other surgeons to do the same. He did become the head of the office where he had been, and continued going forward, compiling, analyzing, and publishing data, including important articles on battlefield injuries, especially vascular injuries. And this volume, which didn't come out until 1955, but it's the official volume on the treatment of vascular injuries in World War II, published by the Medical Department in the U.S. Army. He also published an important book on logistics of casualty treatment with the famous statistician Gilbert Beebe. He also played a big part in putting together the post-war VA system and its immense uplifting following the war. The medical follow-up agency was DeBakey's idea. It was later led by Gilbert Beebe for many years. So the professional significance of these years to Dr. DeBakey's career is that he became and met many of the leaders in American medicine and politics who would later be good friends. He honed skills in medical data gathering and analysis, as we've indicated. He certainly learned the inner workings of Washington, D.C., and became adept at strategy and tactics of administration. Then he returned to Tulane, and shortly after that was contacted by the fledgling administration of a new medical school in Houston, the Baylor University College of Medicine, that was looking to start a department of surgery and wanted a new professor and chairman. And this is the letter from July 14th, 1948, in which Dr. DeBakey accepts the offer to become the new professor and chairman at the Department of Surgery in Baylor University College of Medicine. So sorry we ran over a little bit there, but thank you very much for your attention. And if anyone happens to have any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them.
That was absolutely delightful. Thank you very much. Very comprehensive. I suspect this is only a fraction of the book because you cover his entire life, but with an incredible insight into how it all began. Time is very short, and I'm going to ask you a general question. It's interesting how DeBakey ran across and interacted with luminaries of his era. What was it about DeBakey that attracted those people, or was it just circumstance?
I think some of it was circumstance, but a lot of it was work ethic. The reason why I ended up in Washington, D.C. and got out of Gulfport, Mississippi was because, I didn't have time to go into this, but the head of the surgical consultants division there was Fred Rankin. And Fred Rankin, of course, had been at Mayo Clinic and in Kentucky, been the president of the College of Surgeons, president of the AMA. He was very well connected, and he knew DeBakey for two reasons. He knew him from his national presentations and papers, and he knew him because this was Oxner's boy. And no doubt, I don't have any, I looked for actual hard evidence, but there's no doubt that Oxner whispered in Fred Rankin's ear at some point and said, you got to get this guy into the hub. Then when he got there, he, just by force of nature, he just never stopped working, as he mentioned. And you see all the things that he did that couldn't help but make an overwhelming impression on the people that he worked for and with.
He has a reputation of being demanding and tyrannical. Any of that true about his performance in the operating room?
Yeah, very similar to Zollinger, really, in that it was almost always delivered towards the surgical trainee. He tended not to be tough on the students and the colleagues. That was fine. The patients adored him because he would put on what they call the sugarcane accent and sit down there and take their hand in his. And he was a totally different entity at that time. But if you were in the operating room with him or on the ward, yeah, tough as nails, just like the Big Z.
Well, on that note, I'm going to call this to a close. Again, we could talk for hours and hours about this terrific topic. But Dr. Miller, thank you again for a great presentation. Absolutely fascinating. And I'd like to thank everybody who signed on this evening for our quote breakfast. We had a great time and learned a lot. And we look forward to the rest of the college meeting and again, meeting you all live next year. So thank you again.
Night.